In the unforgiving heat of the Arizona desert, where most men would perish within days, Jeremiah McCall had carved out a solitary existence for 3 decades. The weathered cowboy had turned his back on civilization after losing his beloved wife to fever, choosing the harsh beauty of the wilderness over the painful memories of town life. His days followed the same quiet rhythm, tending his small herd, repairing weathered fence posts, and watching the sun paint the desert sky in shades of amber and crimson. But on this particular evening, as the temperature finally began to drop with the setting sun, a figure appeared on the horizon that would change everything. A woman in fine clothing, slumped over her horse, barely conscious from heat and thirst. When Jeremiah helped her down from her mount, he saw something in her eyes that stirred feelings he'd buried long ago. What he didn't know was that this mysterious stranger carried secrets that would put both their lives in mortal danger. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The desert had become Jeremiah's confessor, his companion, and his judge. Every morning for 30 years, he had awakened to the same vast expanse of sand and stone that stretched beyond the horizon, broken only by the occasional saguaro cactus standing like a sentinel against the endless sky. His homestead sat in a natural hollow between 2 red rock formations, positioned to catch the precious shade during the brutal afternoon hours and sheltered from the worst of the winter winds that could cut through a man's bones. The adobe walls of his modest dwelling bore the weathered patina of decades, their surfaces marked by the relentless cycle of scorching days and surprisingly cool nights. He had built this place with his own hands, using techniques learned from the Mexican vaqueros who had worked these lands generations before him. The roof was flat, practical, designed to catch and channel the rare desert rains into the cistern he had carved from solid rock. Every board, every stone, every carefully placed timber represented not just shelter, but a conscious choice to remain apart from the world that had taken everything from him. Inside, the house reflected the Spartan existence of a man who had stripped his life down to its most essential elements. A single room served as kitchen, living area, and bedroom, with a small alcove that had once been intended for children who never came. The furniture was handmade, sturdy, and functional, a table worn smooth by countless meals eaten in solitude, 2 chairs, though only one had seen use in decades, a bed barely large enough for 1 person. The walls held no decoration save for a single photograph, faded now, of a woman with gentle eyes and dark hair, pinned back in the fashion of a bygone era. Sarah McCall had been the light of his world, and when that light was extinguished by a fever that swept through their small town like wildfire, Jeremiah had felt something fundamental die within him. They had been married only 3 years, but those years had contained more joy than most men found in a lifetime. She had shared his dreams of building something lasting in this harsh land, of raising children who would understand both the beauty and the danger of the frontier. When she died, clutching his hand and whispering his name, those dreams had died with her. The wooden box on his nightstand contained the only remnant of that life, Sarah's wedding ring, a simple band of gold that had cost him 2 months' wages from his work on the railroad. He had never been able to bring himself to bury it with her, nor could he bear to wear it. Instead, it rested in that box, a tangible reminder of what love could be and what loss could do to a man's soul. Some nights, when the desert wind howled through the rocks and the loneliness pressed down like a physical weight, he would take out the ring and hold it to the lamplight, remembering the day he had slipped it onto her finger and promised to love her until the end of time. His daily routine had become a ritual of survival, both physical and emotional. Before dawn, he would rise and tend to his small herd of cattle, hardy beasts that had adapted to the desert's challenges much as he had. The work was demanding, checking the windmill that pumped water from the deep well, mending fences that the occasional flash flood or wandering wildlife had damaged, treating injuries and illnesses that could quickly become fatal in the unforgiving climate. But the work was also salvation, keeping his hands busy and his mind focused on practical matters rather than the ghosts that haunted his quieter moments. His interactions with the outside world were limited to the occasional trading post visit, perhaps twice a year, when he would exchange cattle or handmade goods for the few supplies he could not produce himself. The townspeople had learned to respect his solitude, understanding that some griefs were too deep to be salved by well-meaning conversation or social obligation. He had become something of a legend in the scattered communities of the territory, the hermit cowboy who had loved once and loved completely, then chosen the desert over the risk of loving again. The woman who had appeared on his horizon that evening was unlike anything he had encountered in his years of isolation. Even in her current state of near collapse, there was something unmistakably refined about her bearing, something that spoke of education, privilege, and a life far removed from the harsh realities of frontier existence. Her clothing, though travel-stained and torn, was of the finest quality silk, where most frontier women wore cotton, delicate lacework, where others made do with simple stitching, boots crafted from leather, so supple it must have cost more than most families earned in a month. As he lifted her from her horse, Jeremiah noticed details that would have escaped a less observant man. Her hands, though calloused from the journey, showed the remains of careful manicuring. Her hair, matted now with dust and sweat, held the subtle fragrance of expensive perfume. Most telling of all were her eyes. When they fluttered open briefly as he carried her toward the house, they held the unmistakable intelligence and authority of someone accustomed to command. The horse she rode was another puzzle. The animal was magnificent, clearly Arabian bloodstock, with lines that spoke of careful breeding and considerable expense. The saddle was hand-tooled leather with silver fittings, and the bridle bore intricate metalwork that suggested both European craftsmanship and considerable value. This was not the mount of a common traveler, nor even of a wealthy merchant's daughter. This was the horse of someone with serious money and serious need for both speed and endurance. Jeremiah settled the woman on his bed, the first time in 30 years that another person had occupied that space. He worked with gentle efficiency, checking for injuries, offering water in careful sips, and covering her with one of his heavy blankets. Her breathing was shallow but steady, her pulse rapid but strong. She would live, but it had been a close thing. Another few hours in that desert heat without water, and he would have been digging a grave instead of tending a patient. As he worked, he found himself studying her face, trying to read the story written in its lines and expressions. She was beautiful, certainly, but it was a beauty tempered by experience and marked by recent hardship. There were faint lines around her eyes that spoke of laughter and sorrow in equal measure, and a small scar near her left temple that suggested she had not lived an entirely sheltered life. Her lips, cracked now from dehydration, still held a natural fullness that made him think of whispered endearments and gentle kisses. The thought struck him like a physical blow. He had not allowed himself to think of a woman in romantic terms since Sarah's death, had not permitted his mind to wander down paths that led to desire and longing. Yet here he was, caring for a stranger and feeling something stir within him that he had thought permanently buried. The sensation was both thrilling and terrifying, like discovering he could still feel pain in a limb he had thought permanently numbed. Through the night, he kept vigil beside her, checking her condition, offering water when she was conscious enough to drink, and fighting the urge to smooth the damp hair from her forehead. When fever dreams made her restless, he spoke to her in the same gentle tones he had once used to calm frightened cattle, and gradually she would settle. Once, in the depths of the night, she reached out blindly and grasped his hand, holding it with surprising strength while she whispered words in a language he did not recognize. As dawn approached, painting the desert sky in shades of rose and gold, Jeremiah realized that something fundamental had shifted in his carefully ordered world. The woman's presence had broken through the protective shell he had built around his heart, forcing him to confront emotions he had spent 3 decades trying to forget. Whether she was a blessing or a curse remained to be seen, But one thing was certain: his days of comfortable isolation were over. The desert sunrise that had greeted him alone for so many years now illuminated two figures in his modest home, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Jeremiah McCall felt something that might have been hope stirring in his chest. Whatever secrets this mysterious woman carried, whatever danger might have driven her to his door, she had already accomplished something he had thought impossible. She had reminded him that his heart was still capable of beating for someone other than a ghost. The woman stirred as the morning sun crept through the single window of Jeremiah's adobe home, casting long shadows across the rough-hewn floor. Her eyelids fluttered, and for a moment she seemed to struggle against consciousness, as if awakening meant facing truths she wasn't ready to confront. When her eyes finally opened fully, they held the alert wariness of someone who had learned to assess danger before fully emerging from sleep. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice hoarse from thirst and exhaustion. The accent was cultured, refined, with the careful pronunciation of someone who had been educated in proper speech. "Safe," Jeremiah replied, setting down the cup of water he had been preparing. "You're in my home, about 30 miles southeast of Tucson. You nearly died of heat exhaustion yesterday evening." She accepted the water gratefully, drinking in careful sips as her eyes surveyed the modest interior. He watched her take in the sparse furnishings, the practical arrangements, the photograph of Sarah on the nightstand. There was something calculating in her gaze, as if she were cataloguing details for future reference. "I'm Belle," she said finally, offering what he suspected was not her real name. "Belle Martinez. I was traveling to meet my father's business associates in Phoenix when my guide abandoned me. Took my money and most of my supplies 3 days ago." Jeremiah nodded, though something in her story didn't sit right. Her horse alone was worth more than most men earned in several years, yet she spoke of being robbed as if it were a minor inconvenience. More troubling was the way she unconsciously touched her left hand, as if checking for something that was no longer there. "Well, Belle Martinez," he said, testing the name, "you're welcome to stay until you're strong enough to travel. Phoenix is a hard journey from here, especially alone." Over the next 3 days, Belle gradually regained her strength, but her presence transformed Jeremiah's carefully ordered existence. She insisted on helping with daily chores, despite his protests, and her efforts revealed both surprising capability and obvious inexperience with manual labor. She could organize supplies with military efficiency, but had clearly never milked a cow or mended a fence. When she attempted to help with cooking, her technique suggested someone familiar with directing servants rather than working with her own hands. The evenings were the most revealing. As they sat by the fire, sharing simple meals of beans and hardtack, Belle would slip into educated discourse about politics, literature, and world events with a knowledge that seemed far beyond what a merchant's daughter should possess. She caught herself more than once, covering her expertise with self-deprecating comments about her father's extensive library or her governess's thorough education. It was during one of these fireside conversations that Jeremiah noticed the pale band of skin around the ring finger of her left hand. When he mentioned it, Belle's hand instinctively moved to cover the mark, and for a moment her composure slipped entirely. "I was married," she said quietly. "He died in an accident. I removed the ring when I began this journey too painful to wear." The explanation was plausible, but Jeremiah had lived too long not to recognize the signs of a carefully constructed lie. The mark on her finger was too recent, too precise, suggesting a ring removed within days rather than months. More tellingly, when she spoke of her dead husband, her grief seemed forced, rehearsed, lacking the authentic pain that still marked his own voice when he mentioned Sarah. On the 4th night, Belle's careful facade cracked completely. Jeremiah awakened to the sound of her crying out in her sleep, words tumbling from her lips in a mixture of English and Spanish that revealed far more than her waking conversations ever had. "No, Don Carlos, you cannot do this to our people," she whispered, her voice thick with anguish. "The treaty was sacred. You swore on your honor. The assassinaciono, I will not let you destroy everything we built. She thrashed in the bed, her hands clawing at invisible threats, her voice rising in panic. Guards! Traitors in the council chamber! They mean to kill Mawan Captain Rodriguez. Jeremiah moved quickly to wake her, gently shaking her shoulder until her eyes snapped open, wide with terror. For a moment, she stared at him without recognition, her breathing rapid and shallow. Then awareness returned, and with it, the careful mask she had worn for days. A nightmare, she said, attempting to regain her composure. I've had them since the bandits attacked our caravan. Sometimes I dream they're still chasing me. But Jeremiah had heard enough to know that bandits were not the source of her terror. The names she had spoken, the references to treaties and councils and assassination attempts, painted a picture of political intrigue far removed from the simple story of a robbed merchant's daughter. He said nothing, but he saw the knowledge in her eyes. He knew he had heard too much. The next morning brought visitors. Jeremiah was repairing a section of fence when he spotted the dust cloud on the horizon, still miles away but approaching steadily. 3 riders, moving with the purposeful pace of men on a mission. Belle saw them too, and the blood drained from her face. I have to go, she said, her voice tight with panic. Right now, they can't find me here. Who are they? Jeremiah asked, though part of him already knew the answer. Men who want to hurt me, she replied, not quite meeting his eyes. Men who won't hesitate to hurt anyone who's helped me. The riders were still an hour away, but Belle was already moving toward the small corral where her horse waited. Jeremiah watched her for a moment, seeing the terror in her movements, the way she kept glancing over her shoulder as if expecting immediate pursuit. Whatever game of cat and mouse she was playing, the stakes were deadly serious. The root cellar, he said suddenly. Belle stopped, turning to face him with hope and desperation warring in her expression. There's a root cellar built into the rocks behind the house. It's well hidden, cool, and has a separate entrance. You can wait there until they pass. She hesitated, clearly torn between the desire to run and the practical wisdom of hiding. They'll ask questions. If they think you're lying, let me worry about that, Jeremiah said, surprised by the protectiveness in his own voice. Get in the cellar. Take water and food. Don't come out until I tell you it's safe. As Belle disappeared into the hidden chamber, Jeremiah found himself making a choice that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. He was willingly placing himself in danger for a woman whose real name he didn't even know, whose story was clearly fabricated, and whose past was obviously shadowed by violence and political intrigue. Yet something about her vulnerability, her desperate need for sanctuary, had awakened protective instincts he thought had died with Sarah. The riders arrived an hour later, their horses lathered with sweat and their faces grim with purpose. They were hard men, professionals, with the kind of watchful alertness that spoke of military training and recent violence. The leader, a man with a carefully waxed mustache and expensive boots, dismounted with the casual arrogance of someone accustomed to intimidating others. "Senor," he said, his English heavily accented but precise, "we seek a woman who may have passed this way. She rides a fine Arabian horse and wears expensive clothing. She is dangerous, wanted for crimes against the state." Jeremiah leaned against his fence post, projecting the image of a simple hermit with nothing to hide. "Haven't seen any fine ladies out here, amigo. Nothing but desert rats and buzzards for company." The man's eyes narrowed, studying Jeremiah's face for signs of deception. "You live alone, yes? No wife? No family?" "Been alone for 30 years, Jeremiah replied truthfully. "Prefer it that way." After searching the property and finding nothing suspicious, the riders departed, but not before leaving Jeremiah with a final warning. "If this woman appears, do not help her. She is a dangerous criminal, and those who aid her will be considered enemies of the state." As the dust settled and the riders disappeared over the horizon, Jeremiah realized that his quiet, solitary existence had just become infinitely more complicated. Belle Martinez, or whatever her real name might be, had brought danger to his doorstep. But she had also brought something else, the first stirring of purpose he had felt in 3 decades. When he helped her emerge from the root cellar, her gratitude was overwhelming and genuine. For the first time since her arrival, the carefully constructed mask slipped completely, revealing the frightened woman beneath the composed exterior. "Thank you," she whispered, and in those 2 words, Jeremiah heard depths of meaning that spoke to his soul. "I won't forget this kindness." As evening fell, and they sat by the fire, both knew that the time for partial truths and careful deceptions was ending. The danger had found them once, and would find them again. But for tonight, they had sanctuary, and for Jeremiah, that was enough to kindle a flame of hope he had thought permanently extinguished. The leather journal had been Jeremiah's constant companion during his first years of isolation, its pages filled with the raw grief and gradual acceptance of a man learning to live alone. He had written in it faithfully for nearly a decade, documenting his daily struggles, his memories of Sarah, and his slow adaptation to desert life. Then, as the sharp edges of his pain had worn smooth, the entries had become less frequent, finally stopping altogether when he realized he had nothing left to say to the empty pages. Now, for the first time in 20 years, he found himself reaching for the journal again. Belle's presence had stirred something in him that demanded expression, thoughts and feelings too complex to carry silently. As she slept peacefully in his bed, recovering from her ordeal, he sat at his table and opened the journal to a fresh page. "Day 1 since the woman arrived," he wrote, his handwriting rusty from disuse. "She calls herself Belle Martinez, but I know that's not her real name. Everything about her speaks of secrets, of a life far different from the story she tells. Yet when I look at her, I see something that reminds me of what it felt like to care for another person." The admission, even written in privacy, unsettled him. He had built his entire existence around the principle of emotional detachment, of never again allowing himself to become vulnerable to loss. Yet here he was, after just a few days, already feeling the stirrings of something dangerously close to affection. Belle's recovery progressed steadily over the following week. Each morning brought renewed color to her cheeks and increased steadiness to her movements. She insisted on contributing to the household tasks, though her efforts often revealed the vast difference between her background and his own. When she attempted to help with the laundry, she used far too much soap and scrubbed the clothes with an intensity that suggested she was more familiar with directing servants than performing manual labor herself. "You're going to wear holes in my best shirt," Jeremiah observed, watching her attack a stubborn stain with the determination of a general planning a military campaign. Belle paused, looking down at the garment in her hands with sudden awareness. "I'm sorry. I'm not very good at this, am I?" "Not bad for someone who's learning," he said diplomatically. "Where did you grow up that you never learned to do laundry?" The question was casual, but he watched her face carefully for the telltale signs of another fabricated story. Sure enough, her expression tightened slightly, and she looked away before answering. "My mother died when I was young," she said, which might have been true. "My father hired women to take care of the household duties. I was expected to focus on my education." "Must have been some education," Jeremiah commented. "I've heard you quote Shakespeare and discuss the political situation in Mexico with more insight than most newspaper writers." Belle's hands stilled in the wash water. "My father believed in thorough schooling for his children. He said knowledge was the only wealth that couldn't be stolen." It was a beautiful sentiment, and probably true, but it didn't explain the unconscious authority in her voice when she spoke of governance and policy, or the way she sometimes seemed to catch herself before revealing too much about political machinations that a merchant's daughter should have no knowledge of. Their evenings had developed a comfortable rhythm. After the day's work was done, they would sit by the fire, sharing simple meals and increasingly complex conversations. Belle was an excellent listener, drawing out stories of Jeremiah's past with gentle questions and genuine interest. She learned about his childhood in Kansas, his work on the railroad, his courtship of Sarah, and their brief but intensely happy marriage. "She sounds like a remarkable woman," Belle said one evening, studying the faded photograph that still held the place of honor on Jeremiah's nightstand. "You must have loved her very much." "More than life itself," Jeremiah replied, surprised by how easily the words came. "When she died, I thought my heart had died with her. I came out here to this desert because I couldn't bear to be around people who were still living their lives while mine had ended." "And now?" Belle asked softly. The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither was quite ready to address directly. Jeremiah felt the weight of her gaze, the gentle pressure of her inquiry, and found himself speaking truths he hadn't planned to share. "Now I'm beginning to remember that a heart can heal, even when you think it's been broken beyond repair." Belle's smile was radiant, transforming her face from merely beautiful to something that took his breath away. "I'm glad," she said simply. "No one should have to carry that much pain alone." As the days passed, their relationship deepened in ways both subtle and profound. Belle had a gift for finding humor in the small disasters that marked their daily attempts to blend their very different backgrounds. When she accidentally fed the chickens bread that was meant for their dinner, she laughed at herself with such infectious joy that Jeremiah found himself laughing too, the sound rusty from disuse but genuine. "I don't think I've laughed like that in 20 years, he admitted, wiping tears from his eyes. "Then you were overdue," Belle replied, still giggling. "Besides, the chickens seem to approve of my cooking more than you do." Their physical awareness of each other grew gradually, marked by small moments of connection. When Belle stumbled while carrying water from the well, Jeremiah's steadying hand on her arm sent electricity through both of them. When she helped him tend a cut on his finger, her gentle touch lingered longer than medical necessity required. They were dancing around their attraction, both recognizing it but neither quite ready to acknowledge it openly. The turning point came during one of their evening conversations, when Belle made a casual comment about the challenges of leadership that revealed far more than she intended. "The hardest part about making decisions that affect others," she said, staring into the fire, "is knowing that even your best intentions can sometimes lead to tragedy. People trust you to guide them, but you're just as fallible as anyone else." Jeremiah studied her profile in the firelight, noting the weight of experience in her voice. "Sounds like you've had some experience with that kind of responsibility." Belle caught herself, glancing at him with a startled expression. "I mean, that is, I've observed my father dealing with business decisions that affected his employees. The burden of command, you might say." But her choice of words, burden of command, was military, not commercial. Combined with her earlier nightmares about treaties and assassination attempts, it painted a picture of someone who had held genuine authority, not merely observed it from the sidelines. "Belle," Jeremiah said carefully, "whatever trouble you're running from, whatever secrets you're carrying, you should know that you can trust me. I've already chosen to help you. Nothing you could tell me would change that." For a moment, he thought she might confess everything. Her eyes filled with tears, and her carefully maintained composure wavered. But then she looked away, and when she spoke, her voice was steady again. "There are some secrets that are dangerous to share," she said quietly. "Some truths that put everyone around you at risk. I care about you too much to burden you with mine." The admission that she cared about him sent warmth flooding through Jeremiah's chest. It was the first time either of them had acknowledged the growing emotional connection between them, and it changed everything. "I'm a grown man," he said gently. "I can decide for myself what risks I'm willing to take." Belle reached across the space between them and took his hand, her fingers warm and surprisingly strong. "I know you can, but I'm not ready to test that yet. Can you give me a little more time?" Jeremiah squeezed her hand gently, feeling the calluses she had developed from their days of shared labor. "All the time you need," he promised, though something in his gut warned him that time might be a luxury they couldn't afford. That night, as he wrote in his journal by lamplight, Jeremiah found himself recording not just the day's events, but his growing feelings for the mysterious woman who had transformed his solitary existence. "She trusts me enough to stay, but not enough to tell me the truth," he wrote. I should be frustrated by her deception, but instead I find myself hoping she'll choose to confide in me. Whatever danger she's running from, whatever secrets she carries, I want to be the one she turns to when she's ready to stop running. Sarah, if you can hear me somehow, I hope you understand. I will always love you, but I think I'm falling in love with Belle too. It doesn't diminish what we had it, just proves that the heart you gave me is still capable of beating for someone else. As he closed the journal and prepared for sleep, Jeremiah realized that his careful, controlled existence was spiraling into something far more complex and dangerous than he had experienced in decades. But for the first time since Sarah's death, he felt truly alive. The wooden comb took shape slowly under Jeremiah's patient knife, each careful stroke of the blade revealing the smooth grain of the desert ironwood. He had been working on it for 3 evenings, sitting by the fire while Belle read aloud from one of his few books, her cultured voice bringing new life to familiar passages. It was the first gift he had made for another person since Sarah's death, and the significance of that fact was not lost on him. "What are you carving?" Belle asked, looking up from the volume of poetry she had been reading. Her hair fell in dark waves around her shoulders, freed from the practical braid she wore during the day's work. "Nothing much," Jeremiah replied, his weathered hands still working the wood, "just keeping my fingers busy." But Belle was observant, and she had noticed the care he was taking with the piece, the way he held it up to the light to check the smoothness of each tooth, the gentle testing of each curve against his palm. When he finally presented it to her the next morning, her reaction was everything he had hoped for and more. "It's beautiful," she whispered, holding the comb up to catch the early sunlight. The ironwood gleamed with a warm reddish hue, and each tooth was perfectly shaped and smooth. "You made this for me?" "Your hair needs proper care," Jeremiah said, suddenly self-conscious about the gesture. "That old brush of mine isn't suitable for a lady." Belle's smile was radiant as she ran her fingers along the comb's surface. "No one has given me anything like this in years. Something made just for me, with their own hands." There was a wistfulness in her voice that spoke of a life filled with expensive gifts, but empty of genuine personal attention. Jeremiah found himself wondering what kind of world she came from, where handmade tokens of affection were rare treasures rather than common expressions of care. "Show me how to use it properly," she said, settling beside him on the rough wooden bench outside his door. "I'm afraid I'm not very skilled at managing my hair without help." The admission was another small crack in her carefully constructed persona. Ladies of modest means learn to care for themselves out of necessity, but Belle's confession suggested a background of privilege where personal maids handled such intimate tasks. Jeremiah said nothing about the inconsistency, instead focusing on the trust she was showing by asking for his help. "My mother had beautiful hair," he said, gently working the comb through the tangles that the desert wind had created. "She taught me to be gentle, to start at the ends and work upward. Hair is like trust. If you're too rough with it, it breaks." Belle closed her eyes, leaning into his touch as he worked. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." She was. She used to say that you could tell a lot about a person by how they treated things that were delicate. Hair, animals, children, anything that couldn't defend itself against rough handling. "And what does my hair tell you about me?" Belle asked, though there was something almost vulnerable in the question. Jeremiah paused in his work, considering not just her hair but everything he had observed about her over the past weeks. "It tells me you're used to being cared for, but not necessarily cherished. It's beautiful, but it's been neglected recently, like you've been too focused on survival to pay attention to the softer parts of yourself." Belle was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "You see too much, Jeremiah McCall. Maybe. Or maybe I'm just learning to see you." The intimacy of the moment was broken by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Both of them tensed, Belle's hand instinctively moving to her throat, where Jeremiah had noticed she sometimes touched, as if checking for jewelry that was no longer there. But this visitor was different, a single rider, moving at a leisurely pace rather than the urgent gallop of pursuers. The stranger who approached was an elderly Mexican vaquero, his weathered face creased with the kind of smile that spoke of a naturally cheerful disposition. He raised his hand in greeting as he drew near, his posture relaxed and non-threatening. "Buenos dias, señor," he called out in accented English. "I am Miguel Santos. I work for Señor Patterson's ranch, 20 miles north. We have lost some cattle in the recent storm, and I wonder if you have seen them." Jeremiah stood, automatically positioning himself between the stranger and Bell. "Haven't seen any strays, amigo, but you're welcome to water your horse and rest in the shade." Miguel dismounted gratefully, accepting the offered hospitality with the courtesy of a man raised in the old traditions. As he watered his horse, his eyes took in the domestic scene, the wooden comb in Belle's hands, the obvious care in Jeremiah's manner toward her, the small signs of a shared life that had developed between them. "You have a lovely wife, Señor," Miguel said with a respectful nod toward Belle. "She reminds me of my own Rosa when we were young." Belle's face flushed, but she didn't correct the assumption. Instead, she smiled graciously and offered the old man some water and dried fruit. Jeremiah watched the interaction with interest, noting how naturally Belle fell into the role of gracious hostess, her movements and speech patterns suggesting someone accustomed to receiving guests of importance. "How long have you worked for Patterson?" Belle asked, and Jeremiah caught the subtle shift in her tone, still friendly, but with the undertone of someone gathering information. 15 years, Signora. He is a good patron, fair and honest, but these are difficult times for ranchers. There are rumors of trouble in the territory, political upheaval that makes everyone nervous." Belle's expression sharpened almost imperceptibly. "What kind of trouble?" "They say Queen Isabella has disappeared from her palace in Nueva Esperanza. Some claim she was murdered, others that she fled to escape assassination. The territory is in chaos without her leadership." Jeremiah felt Belle go rigid beside him, though she managed to keep her expression neutral. "That's terrible," she said carefully. "What do people think happened to her?" Miguel shrugged, his expression troubled. "Who can say? She was a good queen, beloved by her people. But power makes enemies, and there are always those who would profit from chaos. Some say she had enemies in her own court, people who wanted her dead so they could seize control." The conversation continued for a few more minutes, but Jeremiah was no longer listening to the words. He was watching Belle's face, seeing the barely controlled tension in her jaw, the way her hands gripped the wooden comb as if it were a lifeline. When Miguel finally rode away, waving cheerfully and promising to spread word if he heard anything about the missing cattle, Belle remained silent for a long time. "You want to tell me about Queen Isabella?" Jeremiah asked gently. Belle looked at him with eyes that held depths of pain and fear he was only beginning to understand. "She was a remarkable woman," she said quietly. "She tried to do right by her people, to build something lasting and good. But she made enemies of powerful men who cared more about their own wealth than the welfare of the territory. You speak of her as if you knew her personally." "In a way, I did." Belle's voice was barely above a whisper. "She was everything I aspired to be: strong, principled, willing to sacrifice for others. Her disappearance is a tragedy for everyone who believed in her vision." Jeremiah reached out and gently took her hand, feeling the tremor that ran through her fingers. "And if she were still alive, if she had escaped the assassination attempt?" Belle met his eyes, and for a moment he saw the truth blazing there: the authority, the burden of command, the weight of responsibility that no merchant's daughter should carry. But then she looked away, and when she spoke, her voice was steady again. "Then I hope she's found somewhere safe to hide, somewhere with people who would protect her without asking too many questions." The afternoon passed quietly, but the undercurrent of tension never fully dissipated. Belle helped with the daily chores, but her movements were distracted, her mind clearly elsewhere. That evening, as they sat by the fire, she turned the wooden comb over and over in her hands, studying it as if it held answers to questions she couldn't voice. "Jeremiah," she said suddenly, "if you had to choose between your own happiness and the welfare of people who depended on you, what would you do?" The question was loaded with personal significance, and Jeremiah considered it carefully before answering. "I think," he said slowly, "that real happiness comes from being able to live with your choices. If I abandoned people who needed me for my own comfort, I don't think I'd be truly happy. The guilt would eat at me. Belle nodded, her expression troubled. But what if trying to help them put everyone you cared about in danger? What if your very presence was a threat to innocent people? Then I'd have to find a way to help them without being a danger, Jeremiah replied. Or I'd have to trust the people I cared about to make their own choices about what risks they were willing to take. And if they chose to help you, even knowing the danger, then I'd be grateful for their courage and do everything in my power to make sure their sacrifice wasn't in vain. Belle was quiet for a long time, still turning the comb in her hands. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but determined. I've been thinking about leaving soon. My strength is back, and I don't want to impose on your kindness any longer. You're not imposing, Jeremiah said quickly. You're welcome to stay as long as you need to. I know. That's what makes it so hard to go. They sat in comfortable silence, both aware that they were approaching a crossroads. The growing feelings between them could not be denied much longer, but Belle's secret stood like a wall between them, preventing the full intimacy that both desired. Belle, Jeremiah said finally, whatever you're running from, whatever danger you're trying to protect me from, I want you to know something. These past weeks have been the happiest I've had in 30 years. If you leave, you'll be taking a piece of my heart with you. Belle's eyes filled with tears, and she reached out to touch his face with gentle fingers. And you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever, hope. Hope that there's still goodness in the world, still people who care about others without expecting anything in return. Then stay, Jeremiah said simply. Whatever comes, we'll face it together. For a moment, Belle's resolve wavered. But then she shook her head, tears spilling over. I can't. Not yet. But maybe someday, if I can find a way to resolve my situation, I'll come back. And if you can't? Belle leaned forward and kissed his cheek, her lips warm and soft against his weathered skin. Then I'll carry the memory of this time with me always. And I'll treasure this comb as a reminder that someone once cared enough to make something beautiful just for me. As she pulled back, Jeremiah saw something in her expression that filled him with both hope and dread. Belle was preparing to leave, but she was also preparing to fight. Whatever forces had driven her to his door, she was planning to confront them. The only question was whether she would allow him to stand beside her when she did. The morning wind carried more than the usual desert dust. It brought a crumpled piece of paper that caught against the fence post near where Belle was hanging laundry, fluttering like a trapped bird, until she reached out to free it. The moment her eyes fell on the printed image, her face went white as bleached bone. Wanted, Queen Isabella Maria, Consuela de Nueva Esperanza. The portrait showed a regal woman in formal dress, her hair elaborately styled, jewels glittering at her throat and ears. But despite the finery and formal pose, there was no mistaking the face. It was Belle, or rather, the woman who had been calling herself Belle for the past month. Below the portrait, bold letters proclaimed, 10-0 reward for information leading to capture, wanted for treason, murder, and crimes against the state. Belle's hands shook as she read the accusations. According to the poster, Queen Isabella had murdered her own advisors in a fit of madness, stolen the royal treasury, and fled justice. The lies were so outrageous, they would have been laughable if they weren't so dangerous. But Belle Isabella knew that truth mattered little when powerful men needed a scapegoat. She crumpled the poster quickly, glancing around to make sure Jeremiah hadn't seen it. He was working near the corral, his attention focused on repairing a broken gate. For a moment, she considered burning the paper immediately, but something stopped her. This was evidence of how far her enemies' reach extended, how carefully they had crafted their narrative. She smoothed the paper and tucked it into her skirt pocket, her mind already racing through the implications. The wanted poster confirmed what she had suspected. Count Valdez and his allies had successfully seized control of Nueva Esperanza in her absence. They had portrayed her flight as an admission of guilt, her survival as proof of her crimes. Every day she remained hidden was another day they consolidated their power, another day her people suffered under their corrupt rule. Belle? Jeremiah's voice made her jump. He was walking toward her, concern evident in his weathered features. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Just tired," she managed, forcing a smile. "The heat gets to me sometimes." But Jeremiah had learned to read the subtle signs of her distress over the past weeks. Her shoulders carried tension differently when she was frightened, and her eyes held the distant look of someone calculating escape routes. He had seen this expression before, on the night when the riders had searched his property. "Come sit in the shade," he said gently, taking her arm. "You've been working too hard." As they settled on the bench outside his door, Isabella struggled with the weight of her deception. Every kindness Jeremiah showed her, every moment of tenderness between them, deepened her guilt about the lies she had told. He deserved to know the truth, but the truth would put him in mortal danger. "Jeremiah," she said carefully, "what would you do if you discovered that someone you cared about had been lying to you, about everything?" He considered the question seriously, his eyes studying her face. "I suppose it would depend on why they were lying. If it was to protect themselves or someone else, I might understand. If it was to deceive me for selfish reasons, that would be different. And if the truth put you in danger, then I'd want to know even more," he said firmly. "A man should be able to choose his own risks." Isabella felt tears threatening and looked away. Sometimes people lie because they love someone too much to burden them with the truth. "And sometimes," Jeremiah said softly, "people deserve to know the truth because they love someone too much to let them face their troubles alone." The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Isabella's blood turned to ice as she recognized the Formation 6 riders in military precision, moving with the purposeful speed of a hunting party. These were not the local bounty hunters who had searched the property weeks ago. These were professional soldiers, and they were heading directly for the homestead. "The root cellar," Jeremiah said immediately, recognizing the panic in Isabella's eyes. "No," Isabella said, her voice suddenly filled with authority that made Jeremiah look at her sharply. "I'm tired of hiding, tired of running, tired of putting you in danger with my cowardice." Before Jeremiah could protest, she pulled the crumpled wanted poster from her pocket and pressed it into his hands. She watched his face as he read, saw the shock and understanding dawn in his eyes as he looked from the portrait to her face and back again. "Queen Isabella," he said quietly, and there was no question in his voice, only acceptance of a truth he had probably suspected for weeks. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos of emotions in her chest. "My real name is Isabella Maria Consuela de Rivera y Santos, and I was the Queen of Nueva Esperanza. Everything I told you about being Bel Martinez was a lie." Jeremiah studied the poster more carefully, his jaw tightening as he read the accusations. "These charges are all lies," Isabella said quickly. "Count Valdez orchestrated a coup. He murdered my loyal advisors and tried to have me killed. When I escaped, he needed to discredit me to justify his seizure of power." The sound of hoofbeats was growing closer. Jeremiah looked toward the approaching riders, then back at Isabella, his mind clearly racing through the implications. "How many men does he have?" Jeremiah asked, his voice calm and practical. "What?" Isabella was thrown by the question. "Valdez. How many soldiers? How much support in the territory?" "It may be 200 loyal to him personally, but he controls the army now. Why?" Jeremiah stood and walked to the window, assessing the approaching force. 6 men, well-armed, professional bearing. "They're not here to arrest you, they're here to kill you." A live queen could always reclaim her throne, but a dead one can't contradict their story. Isabella felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert wind. "Then I'll face them. I won't let them hurt you because of my mistakes." "Our mistakes," Jeremiah corrected, turning to face her with an expression she had never seen before. Gone was the gentle hermit who had cared for her with such tenderness. In his place stood a man with the hard eyes of someone who had faced violence and survived. "You're not alone anymore, Isabella. And I didn't spend 30 years learning every inch of this desert just to give up without a fight." The riders were close enough now that Isabella could see their leader, Captain Diego Morales, one of Valdez's most ruthless enforcers. She had known him at court, had even trusted him before his true loyalties became clear. He was a man without honor or mercy, and he would indeed kill them both without hesitation. "Jeremiah, you don't understand," Isabella said urgently. "These aren't common bandits. They're trained killers who are about to learn that this old desert rat has a few tricks they weren't expecting," Jeremiah interrupted. He moved with sudden purpose, gathering supplies with the efficiency of a man who had planned for this possibility. "Can you shoot?" "Eyes, but—" "Then get my rifle from over the fireplace. There's a box of ammunition in the drawer beneath." He was already strapping on a gun belt that Isabella had never seen before, the leather worn smooth by years of use. "We're going to make a stand." "You could still hide," Isabella said desperately. "Tell them I left days ago. They might believe you." Jeremiah paused in his preparations and took her face gently in his hands. "Isabella, I've spent 30 years dead inside, just going through the motions of living. These past weeks with you have brought me back to life. I'm not going back to being a ghost. But if we fight and lose, then we lose together," he said simply. "But I'd rather die beside the woman I love than live another 30 years alone." The declaration hit Isabella like a physical blow. "You love me?" "I've loved you since the moment you laughed at those chickens eating our bread," Jeremiah said, his eyes soft despite the danger approaching. "I love your courage, your intelligence, your determination to do right by your people. I love Queen Isabella just as much as I loved Bel Martinez." Tears spilled down Isabella's cheeks, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Then know this, I love you too, Jeremiah McCall. And if we survive this, I want to spend whatever life I have left making up for the lies I told you." The sound of horses stopping outside broke the spell. Jeremiah kissed her forehead quickly, then moved to the window to observe their visitors. "Your Majesty," came Captain Morales's voice from outside, dripping with false respect. "We know you're in there. Come out peacefully, and we'll make your death quick." Isabella joined Jeremiah at the window, her hand finding his. "How do you want to do this?" "We make them think we're going to surrender," Jeremiah said quietly. "Draw them in close, then use the house as cover. The adobe walls will stop most bullets, and there's only one door. They'll have to come at us head-on. And if that doesn't work?" Jeremiah's smile was grim but determined. "Then we improvise." Isabella felt a strange calm settle over her. For weeks, she had been running from her responsibilities, hiding from the consequences of her enemy's treachery. But standing here beside Jeremiah, facing certain death with the man she loved, she felt more like herself than she had since the night she fled her palace. "Captain Morales," she called out, her voice carrying the full authority of her royal bearing. "I am Queen Isabella de Nueva Esperanza, and I do not surrender to traitors and murderers." "Then you will die like the criminal you are," Morales replied, "and your hermit friend will die with you." Isabella squeezed Jeremiah's hand, drawing strength from his steady presence. "So be it. But know that my people will learn the truth eventually, and when they do, Count Valdez's reign will end in blood." The first gunshot shattered the desert silence, and the battle for Isabella's life and her kingdom began in earnest. The bundle of letters was tied with a faded blue ribbon, the same color as the dress Sarah had worn on their wedding day. Jeremiah had kept them in the bottom of his trunk for 30 years, too precious to display, but too meaningful to discard. Now, as bullets splintered the wooden shutters and Captain Morales's men positioned themselves around the homestead, he found himself reaching for them with hands that barely trembled. "What are those?" Isabella asked. Reloading the rifle with the practiced efficiency she had learned during hunting expeditions with her father, back when she was just a princess learning the skills that would serve a frontier queen. "Sarah's letters," Jeremiah replied, settling beside her behind the overturned table they were using for cover. "She wrote to me every day when I was working the railroad crews, even though I was only gone for a week at a time. A bullet thudded into the adobe wall above their heads, sending chips of dried clay raining down on them. Outside, they could hear Captain Morales shouting orders to his men, positioning them for a coordinated assault. But in this moment between volleys, Jeremiah needed Isabella to understand something important. "I kept these letters all these years as a shrine to what I'd lost," he said, carefully unfolding one of the yellowed pages. "But tonight, I want to read them to someone who represents what I've found." Isabella's eyes widened as she realized what he was offering. This was more than just sharing a memory. It was an invitation into the most sacred part of his past, a gesture of trust that went deeper than physical intimacy. "Are you certain?" she asked softly. "Those are your most private treasures." "Which is exactly why I want to share them with you," Jeremiah replied. He selected a letter at random and began to read in a voice that carried 30 years of longing and love. "My dearest Jeremiah," he read, Sarah's careful handwriting bringing her voice back to life across the decades. "The sunrise this morning reminded me of the light in your eyes when you told me you loved me. I know you think these brief separations are hard on me, but they also remind me how precious our time together truly is. Every moment we're apart makes me treasure every moment we're together." Isabella felt tears prick her eyes, understanding the profound gift Jeremiah was giving her. He was showing her that love didn't diminish when it was shared, but expanded to encompass new possibilities. "She sounds like a woman who understood the value of love," Isabella said gently. "She did," Jeremiah agreed, folding the letter carefully. "She used to say that grief was just love, with nowhere to go. But I think she was wrong about that. Love always finds a way to flow forward, even after we think the channel has run dry." Another volley of gunfire erupted outside, closer this time. Captain Morales was moving his men into position for a final assault, but his tactical approach was predictably military direct and overwhelming rather than clever. Jeremiah had fought Apache raiders who were far more creative and dangerous than these uniformed soldiers. "Tell me about Nueva Esperanza," Jeremiah said as they waited for the next phase of the attack. "What kind of queen were you? What did you hope to build there?" Isabella shifted position to get a better view of the approaching soldiers, but she welcomed the chance to speak of her vision rather than dwell on their desperate situation. "I wanted to create something new," she said, her voice filled with passion despite the danger surrounding them. "A territory where Mexican traditions and American innovation could blend together, where people were judged by their character rather than their bloodline or bank account." "Sounds like a worthy dream." "It was more than a dream," Isabella said fiercely. "We built schools that taught both Spanish and English, established trade agreements that benefited everyone, created a court system based on justice rather than corruption. In 5 years, we went from a lawless frontier to a place where families could build lasting homes." Jeremiah heard the pride in her voice, but also the pain of loss. "And Valdez destroyed all of that?" "He's trying to. He represents the old way rule by fear, profit by exploitation, maintain power through violence. He saw our success as a threat to his vision of how the territory should be governed." "What would happen if you went back, if you reclaimed your throne?" Isabella was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. "If I went back, there would be civil war. Valdez has supporters who believe his lies, and they wouldn't simply step aside. Good people would die fighting for both sides. And if you don't go back, then more good people die under his oppression, and everything we built turns to dust." Jeremiah nodded, understanding the impossible choice she faced. "So you're caught between two kinds of responsibility, the duty to spare lives and the duty to save them." "Exactly." Isabella's voice broke slightly. "For weeks, I've been hiding here with you, telling myself I was protecting you from my problems. But really, I was just hiding from the hardest decision of my life." "And what have you decided?" Isabella looked at him with eyes that held new resolution. "That some things are worth fighting for, even when the cost is terrible. My people deserve better than Valdez's rule, and they deserve a queen who won't abandon them when the fight gets difficult." Another letter caught Jeremiah's attention, and he unfolded it with reverent care. "Listen to this," he said, reading Sarah's words aloud. "Sometimes I think the greatest act of love is believing in someone enough to let them be brave. Not trying to protect them from every danger, but trusting them to face their challenges with courage and wisdom." Isabella stared at him, seeing the parallel he was drawing. She was a very wise woman. She was, and she would have understood why I can't let you face this alone. Jeremiah, if we fight Valdez, we're not just risking our lives. We're committing to a war that could last years, that will certainly cost hundreds of lives. Are you prepared for that? Jeremiah folded the letter and placed it carefully back with the others. "Isabella, I've spent 30 years learning something important about loss. The pain of losing someone you love is terrible, but it's not as terrible as the regret of never fighting for them in the first place. And if we lose everything, then we lose it together, fighting for something worth dying for." He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. "But if we win, we build something worth living for." Outside, Captain Morales's voice rang out with renewed arrogance. "Your Majesty, I grow tired of this game. Surrender now, or we'll burn you out." Isabella squeezed Jeremiah's hand, drawing strength from his unwavering support. "Captain Morales," she called back, her voice carrying the full authority of her royal bearing. "I am Isabella de Nueva Esperanza, and I do not surrender to usurpers and murderers." "Then prepare to die, Majesty," came the sneering reply. But Isabella was no longer the frightened fugitive who had collapsed at Jeremiah's door weeks ago. She was a queen again, with a cause worth fighting for and a man worth loving beside her. As the sound of approaching boots announced the final assault, she felt something she hadn't experienced since the night of the coup. "Jeremiah," she said quietly, checking her rifle one last time. "After we survive this, I want you to know that I intend to make an honest man of you." "Is that a proposal, Your Majesty?" "It's a promise," Isabella replied, her smile fierce and determined. "If you'll have a queen who comes with considerable political complications." "I can't think of anything I'd like better," Jeremiah said, and meant it completely. The first boot kicked at the barricaded door, and the battle for their future began in earnest. But for the first time since her flight from the palace, Isabella faced the fight with something more powerful than fear or desperation. She faced it with love and the unshakable belief that some things were worth any sacrifice to protect. The hidden satchel was buried beneath the loose floorboard near the fireplace, wrapped in oilcloth and secured with leather straps that spoke of urgent preparation. As bullets continued to pepper the adobe walls and Captain Morales's men pressed their assault, Isabella crawled across the floor and retrieved the package with hands that shook not from fear, but from the magnitude of what she was about to reveal. "Jeremiah," she called over the sound of splintering wood as the soldiers worked to break down the reinforced door. "There's something else I need to show you." "Now?" Jeremiah asked incredulously, firing another shot through the window that sent one of their attackers diving for cover. "Whatever it is, it can wait until we're not being shot at." "No, it can't," Isabella said firmly, unwrapping the satchel to reveal its contents. "Because this changes everything." The crown jewels of Nueva Esperanza caught the lamplight and threw it back in brilliant flashes of emerald, sapphire, and diamond. Even in the chaotic light of their besieged home, the ancient diadem commanded attention, a work of art that represented 5 generations of royal authority and the legitimate right to rule an entire territory. But it wasn't just the crown that made Jeremiah's eyes widen. Alongside the jewelry was a rolled parchment sealed with red wax, a leather portfolio thick with documents, and a small leather pouch that clinked with the unmistakable sound of gold coins. "Isabella," Jeremiah breathed, momentarily forgetting the danger outside. "What is all this?" "Proof," Isabella said, her voice carrying a new note of authority. "Proof that I am the legitimate queen, proof of Valdez's treachery, and proof that Nueva Esperanza has allies Count Valdez doesn't know about." She unrolled the parchment carefully, revealing an official document heavy with seals and signatures. "This is a treaty with the government of Mexico, recognizing Nueva Esperanza's independence and my authority as queen. It was signed 3 days before Valdez staged his coup. Jeremiah scanned the document quickly, his mind racing through the implications. If this is legitimate, it is, and there's more. Isabella opened the leather portfolio, revealing correspondence from officials in Washington, Mexico City, and even European capitals. I wasn't just building a territory, Jeremiah. I was building a nation, and these letters prove that some very powerful people were supporting that vision. A bullet shattered the lamp, plunging them into darkness, save for the firelight. Captain Morales' voice boomed from outside. "Stop wasting ammunition! Burn them out!" "They're going to set fire to the house," Jeremiah said grimly. "We need to move now." But Isabella was still focused on the documents, her mind working through possibilities that went far beyond their immediate survival. "Jeremiah, if we can get these papers to the right people, Valdez's coup becomes an international incident. Mexico would be forced to intervene, and the United States couldn't ignore the violation of a recognized treaty. First, we have to live long enough to deliver them," Jeremiah pointed out, but he was beginning to understand the larger picture. This wasn't just about a deposed queen fighting for her throne, it was about the future of an entire region. "There's something else," Isabella said, opening the small pouch to reveal not just gold coins, but a collection of cut gems that sparkled even in the dim firelight. "The royal treasury, or at least the portion I was able to save." Jeremiah stared at the wealth displayed before him, enough to buy a small army or to rebuild a kingdom from scratch. How much? Enough to fund a resistance movement for years, enough to hire mercenaries, buy weapons, and support the families of anyone who stands against Valdez. Isabella's eyes met his across the treasure. Enough to make this fight more than just a desperate last stand. The smell of smoke began to drift through the gaps in the shutters. Captain Morales had made good on his threat, and tongues of flame were already licking at the wooden portions of the house. They had minutes before the building became a death trap. "There's a way out," Jeremiah said suddenly. "The tunnel." "What tunnel?" "I dug it years ago, when the Apache raids were frequent. It leads from the root cellar to a position behind the rocks, about 50 yards from here." Jeremiah was already gathering essential supplies. "If we can reach it, we can escape without them knowing." Isabella quickly rewrapped the jewels and documents, securing the satchel across her body. "And then what? We can't run forever, not with what we know now." "We don't run," Jeremiah said, his voice carrying a new determination. "We fight, but we fight smart, with allies and resources, instead of just desperation." As they made their way toward the root cellar, Isabella felt something shift in her understanding of their situation. For weeks, she had thought of herself as a queen without a kingdom, a ruler without power. But the documents in her satchel proved that her authority was recognized far beyond the borders of Nueva Esperanza. Valdez wasn't just fighting a local rebellion, he was violating international law. "Jeremiah," she said, as they reached the concealed entrance to the tunnel, "are you prepared for what this really means? If we do this, if we use these resources to fight back, we're not just fighting for Nueva Esperanza. We're fighting for the principle that nations can't be stolen by ambitious men with enough soldiers." Jeremiah paused at the tunnel entrance, studying her face in the flickering light of the burning house. "And if we don't fight? Then Valdez succeeds, Mexico loses a valuable ally, and the United States loses an opportunity to have a friendly neighbor on its southern border. More importantly, thousands of good people continue to suffer under the rule of a tyrant." "Then we fight," Jeremiah said simply, "but first we survive." The tunnel was narrow and dark, barely wide enough for them to crawl through single file. As they made their way through the cramped passage, Isabella found herself thinking about the irony of their situation. She had fled to this desert to escape the burden of leadership, only to discover that true leadership meant accepting responsibility even when it seemed impossible to bear. "Jeremiah," she whispered as they neared the tunnel's exit, "when we get out of here, I need to ask you something important." "What?" "Will you marry me? Not just because we love each other, but because I need a partner who understands that being a queen means making decisions that affect thousands of lives. Even in the darkness of the tunnel, she could hear the smile in his voice. Is that an official royal proposal? It's a desperate woman asking the man she loves to help her save a kingdom. Then yes, Your Majesty, I accept. They emerged from the tunnel behind a cluster of large rocks, the burning house providing a convenient distraction for Captain Morales and his men. In the distance, Isabella could see her horse magnificent, loyal, and still waiting despite the chaos and gunfire. Where do we go now? Jeremiah asked, checking his weapons and scanning for immediate threats. Isabella looked back at the burning homestead, then at the satchel containing the future of Nueva Esperanza, then at the man who had chosen to stand beside her against impossible odds. We go to war, she said quietly. But first we go to Mexico City. It's time for President Diaz to learn that Count Valdez has been lying to him about the situation in Nueva Esperanza. As they moved carefully toward the horses, keeping to the shadows, while Captain Morales's men focused on the burning building, Isabella felt the weight of leadership settling on her shoulders once again. But this time, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a crown she was finally ready to wear. The Winchester rifle had belonged to Jeremiah's father, carried through the Civil War and countless frontier conflicts before being passed down to a son who had hoped never to use it in anger. Now, as Jeremiah cleaned and oiled the weapon by the light of a small campfire hidden deep in a canyon 30 miles from his burned homestead, he felt the weight of history in his hands. This rifle had defended homesteads, protected families, and taken lives when necessary. Tonight, it would do so again. How many rounds do we have? Isabella asked, checking her own weapons with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned that survival often depended on preparation and attention to detail. Enough for the first engagement, Jeremiah replied, loading the rifle's magazine with careful precision. After that, we'll have to make every shot count. They had been planning for 3 days, ever since their escape from Captain Morales's assault. The journey to reach their current position had been harrowing, grinding hard across the desert, avoiding the main trails, and stopping only long enough to rest the horses and plan their next move. But now, hidden in this remote canyon that Jeremiah had used as a refuge during his early years of isolation, they were finally ready to take the fight to their enemies. The intelligence they had gathered was both encouraging and terrifying. Isabella's contacts in the scattered settlements had confirmed that Count Valdez was indeed consolidating power in Nueva Esperanza, but his rule was far from secure. The people were growing restless under his harsh taxation and arbitrary justice, and several prominent families had begun to quietly oppose his regime. More importantly, word of Isabella's survival was spreading, giving hope to those who had thought their legitimate queen was dead. Miguel Santos brought news from the Patterson Ranch, Isabella said, consulting the map they had drawn of Valdez's strongholds. Valdez has stationed a garrison of 50 men at the old mission, controlling the main trade route. If we can take that position, we cut off his supply line and show the people that he's not invincible. Jeremiah studied the tactical situation with the eye of a man who had fought both conventional and guerrilla campaigns. 50 men in a fortified position against the two of us. Those are long odds, even with the element of surprise. Not just the two of us, Isabella said, her eyes bright with something that might have been hope or determination. Father Martinez at the mission has been secretly organizing resistance among the local people. He's promised to have 20 men ready to fight when we give the signal. Can we trust him? He married my parents, Isabella said simply. He baptized me as a child and crowned me as queen. If anyone can be trusted to oppose Valdez, it's him. Jeremiah nodded, accepting her judgment. In the days since their escape, he had come to understand that Isabella's knowledge of her people and their loyalties was one of their greatest advantages. She wasn't just a queen, she was a leader who had earned genuine affection and respect from those she governed. The attack plan, he asked. Isabella spread out the detailed sketch they had drawn of the mission compound. The mission has 3 weak points: the main gate, which is heavily guarded, the side entrance near the chapel, which has only 2 sentries, and the supply entrance at the rear, which is usually undefended during the night watch. We go in through the rear? I go in through the rear, Isabella corrected. You create a distraction at the main gate to draw their attention. Once I'm inside, I signal Father Martinez, and his men move on the side entrance. We coordinate our assault to hit all 3 points simultaneously. Jeremiah was quiet for a long moment, studying the plan and finding its weaknesses. What if Father Martinez's men aren't ready? What if the guards are more alert than we expect? What if Valdez has reinforced the garrison since our last intelligence? Then we adapt, Isabella said firmly. Jeremiah, we could plan for months and still not account for every possibility. At some point, we have to trust in our preparation and our cause. And if we fail, then we fail fighting for something worth dying for. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Both of them tensed, hands moving to their weapons. But the rider who emerged from the darkness was Miguel Santos, the elderly vaquero who had become their primary contact with the resistance network. Your Majesty, he said, dismounting and approaching their fire with obvious exhaustion. I bring news from the mission. What news? Isabella asked, though the grim expression on Miguel's face suggested it wasn't good. Captain Morales arrived this afternoon with 30 additional men. Valdez suspects that you're still in the territory, and he's reinforcing all his key positions. Jeremiah swore under his breath. 80 men instead of 50 changed the tactical situation significantly. We need more fighters. There are more, Miguel said, his weathered face brightening slightly. Word of your survival has spread faster than Valdez can contain it. Father Martinez says he can raise 50 men now, maybe more. The people are ready to fight, Your Majesty. They just needed to know their queen was alive. Isabella felt a surge of emotion that was part pride, part fear, and part overwhelming responsibility. These people were willing to risk their lives because they believed in her leadership, and that trust was both a tremendous honor and a terrible burden. 50 men against 80, Jeremiah mused. Still difficult odds, but not impossible. There's something else, Miguel continued. A messenger arrived from Mexico City. President Diaz has received the documents you sent through the church network. He's sending federal troops to investigate the situation in Nueva Esperanza. This was the news Isabella had been hoping for since their escape. If Mexico's federal government intervened, Valdez's coup would lose legitimacy and external support. But federal troops would take weeks to arrive, and in the meantime, Valdez would continue to consolidate his control. How long before the federal forces arrive? She asked. 2 weeks, maybe 3. Isabella exchanged glances with Jeremiah, both understanding the implications. If they attacked the mission and succeeded, they would have momentum and popular support when the federal troops arrived. If they waited for federal intervention, Valdez might have time to eliminate the resistance leadership and present the government with a fait accompli. We attack tomorrow night, Isabella decided. We can't afford to give Valdez more time to prepare. Your Majesty, Miguel said hesitantly, there's one more thing. Captain Morales has issued an ultimatum. If you don't surrender within 1 week, he'll begin executing prominent citizens who he claims are supporting your rebellion, starting with Father Martinez. The threat struck Isabella like a physical blow. Father Martinez wasn't just a valuable ally, he was a beloved figure who had served the community for decades. His execution would be both a personal tragedy and a devastating blow to morale. Then, we definitely attack tomorrow, she said, her voice carrying a new note of steel. Valdez wants to use innocent people as weapons against me. It's time he learned that threats against my people only make me more determined to destroy him. As Miguel departed to carry word of the attack to Father Martinez, Isabella and Jeremiah continued their preparations. They checked their weapons, reviewed their plans, and tried to anticipate every possible complication. But beneath the practical planning, both were aware that they were approaching a moment of truth that would determine not just their own fates, but the future of everyone who had chosen to stand with them. "Jeremiah," Isabella said as they settled down for what might be their last peaceful night together, "are you afraid?" "Terrified," he admitted, without hesitation. "But not of dying. I'm afraid of failing you, of not being worthy of the trust you've placed in me." "And I'm afraid of getting you killed for my ambitions," Isabella replied. "But I'm more afraid of what happens to our people if we don't try." They lay together under the desert stars, holding each other close and drawing strength from their shared commitment. Tomorrow would bring violence and danger, but it would also bring the chance to reclaim a kingdom and build a future worth fighting for. "Isabella," Jeremiah said softly, "whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that these past weeks have been the happiest of my life. You gave me back my heart, and you gave me back my courage," she replied. "Tomorrow, we find out if love and determination are enough to overcome superior numbers and better position." As they drifted towards sleep, both carried the same thought that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds, and some causes were worth dying for, even when victory seemed impossible. Tomorrow would test that conviction in the crucible of combat, but tonight they had each other and the unshakable belief that they were fighting on the side of justice. The battle standard was little more than a strip of royal blue silk torn from one of Isabella's finest gowns. But as it fluttered from the crude flagpole Jeremiah had fashioned from a dead mesquite branch, it carried the weight of centuries of royal authority. They had planted it on the ridge overlooking the mission, just as the sun began to set, a deliberate provocation that would be visible to every man in Captain Morales's garrison. "Let them see it," Isabella had said, her voice carrying the steel of absolute conviction. "Let them know that Queen Isabella has returned to reclaim what was stolen from her." Now, as twilight deepened into full darkness, the flag served its intended purpose. Through his field glasses, Jeremiah could see the increased activity in the mission compound as soldiers pointed toward the ridge and officers barked orders. The element of surprise was gone, but they had gained something perhaps more valuably, psychological advantage of forcing their enemies to react to their initiative. "Morales is smart enough to know this is a trap," Jeremiah observed, watching the patterns of movement in the compound below. "He won't send his whole force up here after us." "No," Isabella agreed, checking her rifle one final time. "But he'll send enough to investigate, and that will thin his defenses when Father Martinez's men make their move." The plan was elegant in its simplicity. The flag would draw a portion of the garrison up the ridge, where Jeremiah's knowledge of the terrain would give them a significant advantage. Meanwhile, Isabella would circle around to link up with the resistance fighters, and together they would assault the weakened mission defenses. If everything went according to plan, they would have control of the compound before the soldiers on the ridge could return to reinforce their comrades. Of course, both of them knew that no plan survived contact with the enemy unchanged. "Movement," Jeremiah said quietly, spotting the torches beginning to make their way up the narrow trail toward their position. "Looks like about 20 men." "Perfect," Isabella replied. "That leaves 60 to defend the mission against 50 attackers. Much better odds than we started with." She gathered her gear and prepared to leave for her rendezvous with Father Martinez. But Jeremiah caught her arm gently. "Isabella," he said, his voice thick with emotion he was struggling to contain, "if something goes wrong—" "Nothing will go wrong," she interrupted, but her eyes betrayed the same fears that haunted him. "If something goes wrong," he continued firmly, "I want you to know that I've never been prouder to stand beside anyone. You're not just reclaiming a throne tonight, you're proving that some things are worth any sacrifice to protect." Isabella rose on her toes and kissed him fiercely, pouring all her love and fear and determination into that single moment of connection. "Come back to me, Jeremiah McCall. We have a kingdom to build together." "Yes, Your Majesty," he said with a smile that was equal parts love and warrior's resolve. Isabella disappeared into the darkness like a ghost, leaving Jeremiah alone with his rifle, his memories, and the approaching torches of Captain Morales's soldiers. He had chosen his position carefully, a natural fortress of red rock that commanded the trail and offered multiple escape routes. The soldiers would have to climb exposed ground to reach him, and every step would be costly. The first shot came sooner than expected. One of the advancing soldiers, more nervous than his companions, fired wildly at a shadow among the rocks. The muzzle flash revealed his position clearly, and Jeremiah's answering shot dropped the man with ruthless efficiency. "Spread out," came Captain Morales' voice from below. "He's alone up there. Flank him from both sides." But Jeremiah had anticipated this tactic. The ridge had been his refuge for decades, and he knew every crevice, every shadow, every possible angle of approach. As the soldiers began their advance, he moved like a ghost among the rocks, firing from unexpected positions and disappearing before return fire could find him. The battle on the ridge was a deadly game of cat and mouse, with Jeremiah using his intimate knowledge of the terrain to pick off individual soldiers while avoiding the concentrated firepower of the main group. Each shot was carefully aimed, each position selected for maximum tactical advantage. He wasn't trying to kill all 20 men, he was trying to keep them occupied long enough for Isabella's assault on the mission to succeed. Below in the valley, the sound of gunfire from the mission compound announced that the second phase of their plan had begun. Isabella and Father Martinez's men were making their move, and from the intensity of the fighting, it was clear that the battle was fierce. "Rodriguez, take 5 men and get back to the mission," Captain Morales shouted, finally recognizing that the real threat wasn't the lone gunman on the ridge, but the attack on his primary position. But Jeremiah wasn't going to let them disengage that easily. As the designated soldiers began to retreat down the trail, he shifted his position to block their path, forcing them to take cover and fight their way through. Every minute he could delay them was another minute for Isabella's assault to gain momentum. The fighting grew more intense as Captain Morales's remaining men pressed their attack with renewed desperation. They knew now that they were facing a coordinated assault, not just a lone madman with a rifle. The stakes had escalated beyond a simple manhunt. It was a battle for control of the territory. Jeremiah took a bullet in his shoulder, the impact spinning him around and sending him sprawling behind a boulder. The wound was painful but not immediately life-threatening, and he gritted his teeth as he tore a strip from his shirt to bind the injury. The pain sharpened his focus rather than diminishing it, reminding him that Isabella was counting on him to hold this position. "He's hit," one of the soldiers shouted. "Press the attack." But wounded animals were often the most dangerous, and Jeremiah proved that axiom as the soldiers rushed his position. His next 3 shots were perfectly placed, dropping 2 men and sending the third diving for cover with a scream of pain. The sound of explosions from the mission compound drew everyone's attention. Someone had used dynamite probably to breach the main gate or destroy a defensive position. The battle for the mission was reaching its climax, and Jeremiah realized that his role in the ridge fight was nearly over. "Fall back," Captain Morales ordered, his voice tight with the recognition that he was losing control of the situation. "All men, fall back to the mission." As the soldiers began their retreat, Jeremiah allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. They had drawn off nearly a quarter of the garrison and kept them occupied during the crucial initial phase of the assault. Now it was time to link up with Isabella and see if their desperate gamble had succeeded. He gathered his gear and began making his way down the ridge, moving carefully to avoid the retreating soldiers. His shoulder throbbed with every movement, but adrenaline and determination kept him going. Somewhere in the chaos below, Isabella was fighting for her throne and her life, and he would not let her face that battle alone. The mission compound was a maze of smoke, gunfire, and shouting men when Jeremiah finally reached the perimeter. The main gate had indeed been destroyed, and resistance fighters were pouring through the breach with makeshift weapons and fierce determination. But the battle was far from over. Captain Morales's men had taken defensive positions in the mission buildings, and they were fighting with the desperation of cornered animals. Through the chaos, Jeremiah caught sight of a familiar figure directing the assault with calm authority. Isabella had traded her royal bearing for a warrior's stance, but there was no mistaking the way she commanded the battlefield. She had found her calling as both queen and general, and she was magnificent in her terrible purpose. The smooth desert stone was no larger than a man's fist, worn by wind and rain into perfect roundness. In any other circumstances, it would have been unremarkable, just another piece of the Arizona landscape. But as Isabella and Jeremiah huddled behind the overturned supply wagon while bullets whined overhead, that simple stone became the foundation for promises that would outlast kingdoms. "If we die here," Isabella said, pressing the stone into Jeremiah's palm, "I want to die as your wife." The battle raged around them with savage intensity. Captain Morales had rallied his remaining men in the mission's main building, turning it into a fortress that commanded the entire compound. Father Martinez's resistance fighters controlled the outer walls, but the cost of taking the courtyard had been terrible and early. Half their number lay wounded or dead among the scattered supplies and broken masonry. "Isabella, this isn't the time," Jeremiah began, but she silenced him with a look that carried all the authority of her royal bloodline. "This is exactly the time," she said firmly. "In 5 minutes we're going to assault that building, and there's a very good chance we won't survive. I will not face death as Isabella de Nueva Esperanza, the dispossessed queen. I will face it as Isabella McCall, the woman who chose love over everything else." Jeremiah looked into her eyes and saw not the desperation of someone facing doom, but the serene determination of someone who had found perfect clarity in the midst of chaos. Around them, the sounds of warfare continued, men shouting orders, weapons firing, the wounded crying for help, but in this moment they existed in a bubble of absolute certainty. "I, Isabella Maria Consuela de Rivera y Santos," she said, her voice steady despite the violence surrounding them, "take you, Jeremiah McCall, as my husband. For whatever time God grants us, in wealth or poverty, in victory or defeat, in life or death." Jeremiah felt tears mixing with the dust and smoke on his face as he understood the profound gift she was offering him. Not just her love, but her trust, her future, her very identity. She was choosing to bind herself to a desert hermit in the middle of a battle that would determine the fate of a kingdom. "I, Jeremiah McCall," he replied, his voice rough with emotion, "take you, Isabella, as my wife, to love and protect for whatever time we have, whether it's measured in minutes or decades." They pressed their hands together around the stone, sealing their vows with a promise older than civilization itself. It wasn't a ceremony that would be recognized by church or state, but it was witnessed by something far more important, their own hearts, and the shared conviction that some bonds transcended legal formalities. "Now," Isabella said, checking her rifle with the calm efficiency of a born warrior, "let's go reclaim my kingdom, husband." The assault on the main building was a coordinated nightmare of smoke, fire, and desperate courage. Father Martinez led half his remaining men through the destroyed chapel, while Isabella and Jeremiah attacked through the supply entrance. The plan was to catch Captain Morales's forces between two advancing fronts, but the captain had anticipated this tactic and positioned his men to create overlapping fields of fire. Jeremiah took another bullet, this one in his leg, and stumbled against a wooden pillar. Isabella was beside him instantly, her face white with fear and fury. "I'm all right," he gasped, though the blood spreading across his pants suggested otherwise. "Keep going. Don't stop for me." "I'm not losing my husband on our wedding day," Isabella snarled, and there was something in her voice that reminded everyone present that she was descended from conquistadors and desert warriors. She helped him to cover behind a massive stone font, then turned her rifle toward the enemy with systematic precision. Her shots were carefully placed, each one forcing Captain Morales's men to keep their heads down, while Father Martinez's group advanced through the chapel. The tide of battle was turning, but slowly, and at a cost that made every small victory feel like a defeat. "Surrender, Your Majesty," Captain Morales called out from his position behind the altar. "You cannot win. Even if you take this mission, Valdez has 1,000 men. You'll never reclaim your throne." "Then I'll die trying." Isabella shouted back, and her voice carried across the compound with royal authority that made even her enemies pause. "But I will not let cowards and usurpers rule my people." It was Father Martinez who broke the stalemate. The elderly priest appeared suddenly in the doorway behind Captain Morales, not as a man of peace, but as a warrior defending his flock. The captain spun to face this new threat, but the moment of distraction was all Isabella needed. Her shot took Captain Morales in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle clattering across the stone floor. The remaining soldiers, seeing their leader wounded and surrounded, began to throw down their weapons. "Enough!" Father Martinez commanded, his voice carrying the moral authority of decades spent serving his community. "This ends now. You men have a choice: continue fighting for a usurper's gold, or stand down and face justice with honor." One by one, the soldiers laid down their arms. They were professionals, not fanatics, and they recognized defeat when it came. Captain Morales, clutching his wounded shoulder, glared at Isabella with hatred, but also with a grudging respect for her courage. "This changes nothing," he said through gritted teeth. "Valdez will never accept your return. He'll burn the entire territory before he surrenders power." "Then we'll rebuild from the ashes," Isabella replied, but her attention was already focused on Jeremiah, who was growing pale from blood loss. The aftermath of the battle was a mixture of triumph and tragedy. They had taken the mission and captured one of Valdez's key strongholds, but the cost had been severe. Of the 50 resistance fighters who had joined the assault, only 32 remained standing. Good men had died to reclaim a single building, and this was just the beginning of what promised to be a long and bloody campaign. "We need to get you to a doctor," Isabella said, kneeling beside Jeremiah as Father Martinez's men secured the compound. "We need to plan our next move," Jeremiah replied stubbornly. "Valdez will send reinforcements as soon as he learns what happened here." "The next move is keeping you alive," Isabella said firmly. "I didn't marry you just to watch you bleed to death an hour later." Father Martinez approached them, his robes torn and stained with smoke, but his eyes bright with something that might have been hope. "Your Majesty," he said formally, then smiled. "Or should I say, Mrs. McCall?" "Your Majesty will do fine," Isabella replied with a tired smile. "Though I appreciate the reminder that some things are more important than titles." "The mission is secure," Father Martinez reported. "We've captured 30 prisoners, including Captain Morales, and enough weapons and supplies to equip twice our number. More importantly, word of your victory is already spreading. People will come to join us now. They needed to see that Valdez could be beaten." Isabella nodded, but her focus remained on Jeremiah's wounds. The bleeding had slowed, but not stopped, and his face was growing increasingly pale. They had won the first battle of their war, but the cost of victory was a constant reminder that some prices were almost too high to pay. "Help me get him inside," she said to Father Martinez, "and send riders to every settlement within 50 miles. Tell them Queen Isabella has returned, and she calls upon all loyal citizens to join her cause." As they carried Jeremiah into the mission's small infirmary, Isabella felt the weight of leadership settling on her shoulders once again. But this time, it was balanced by the warmth of the wedding stone in her pocket and the knowledge that she no longer faced the burden alone. Whatever came next, she would face it as both a queen and a wife, drawing strength from both roles to build the future her people deserved. The wedding rings were carved from desert stone and inlaid with thin bands of gold melted down from Isabella's royal jewelry, creating something entirely new from the remnants of her old life. The craftsmanship was simple but elegant, reflecting the practical beauty that had come to define their relationship. As Isabella slipped the ring onto Jeremiah's finger in the rebuilt chapel 6 months after the battle at the mission, she marveled at how perfectly it suited him, unpretentious, enduring, and beautiful in its honest simplicity. "By the authority vested in me by God and the gratitude of a free people," Father Martinez intoned, his voice carrying across a chapel filled with faces that told the story of their struggle, "I pronounce you husband and wife in the eyes of heaven and earth." The congregation erupted in cheers that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mission. These were the people who had fought beside them, bled with them, and shared in the long, difficult work of rebuilding not just a territory, but a vision of what government could be when it served the people rather than exploiting them. Jeremiah's wounds had healed well, though he would always carry scars from the battle that had changed their lives. The limp was barely noticeable now, and the shoulder wound had left him with only occasional stiffness when the desert nights grew cold. But the deeper wounds, the 30 years of grief and isolation, had healed completely in the warmth of Isabella's love and the purpose they had found together. "Mrs. McCall," Jeremiah said formally, though his eyes danced with humor and affection, "that has a nice sound to it." "I thought so too," Isabella replied, then leaned close to whisper, "though I reserve the right to use your majesty when you're being particularly stubborn." The celebration that followed was unlike anything the territory had seen during Valdez's harsh rule. Tables groaned under the weight of food contributed by families from across the region. Musicians played traditional songs that had been forbidden under the Count's regime, and children who had learned to fear authority laughed and played with the carefree joy that should be every child's birthright. Count Valdez himself was notably absent from the festivities, having fled to Mexico City when federal troops arrived to investigate his unauthorized seizure of power. The investigation had been swift and thorough, particularly after President Diaz reviewed the evidence Isabella had preserved of Valdez's treasonous activities. The Count's remaining supporters had been given the choice of facing trial for their crimes or leaving the territory permanently. Most had chosen exile. "I still can't quite believe it worked," Isabella confessed to Jeremiah as they watched their guests celebrate. "6 months ago, I was a queen without a kingdom, hiding in your root cellar. Now we've rebuilt everything that was destroyed and made it stronger than before." "We had help," Jeremiah reminded her, nodding toward the crowd of people who had made their victory possible. "Miguel Santos and his vaqueros, Father Martinez and his network of loyal citizens, the families who risked everything to support us when the outcome was far from certain." "And you," Isabella said, taking his hand and marveling again at the callous strength of his fingers. "I could never have done this without you." "Same here. Turns out queens and hermits make a pretty good team." The territorial government they had established was a unique blend of Isabella's royal authority and democratic principles that reflected the diverse population they served. The council included representatives from the Mexican families who had been the region's first settlers, the American farmers and ranchers who had arrived more recently, and the Apache leaders who had agreed to peaceful coexistence in exchange for recognition of their traditional hunting grounds. It wasn't perfect, no government ever was, but it was honest, and it was responsive to the needs of the people it served. Trade flourished under the protection of fair laws. Children attended schools that taught both Spanish and English, and disputes were settled by judges who couldn't be bought or intimidated. "Your Majesty," Miguel Santos approached with the respectful formality he had never abandoned, despite Isabella's frequent invitations to be less formal. "The delegation from Washington has arrived for the treaty signing." The treaty would formally recognize Nueva Esperanza's independence and establish trade agreements that would benefit both territories. It represented the culmination of everything Isabella had worked toward, a stable, prosperous nation that could serve as a bridge between Mexico and the United States. "Tell them we'll be along shortly," Isabella replied. "First, I want to enjoy being a bride for a few more minutes." As the sun began to set over the desert that had brought them together, Isabella and Jeremiah stood at the edge of the celebration, watching their people dance and laugh and plan for a future that looked brighter than anyone had dared hope just months before. "Do you ever miss it?" Isabella asked quietly. "The solitude, the simplicity of your old life?" Jeremiah considered the question seriously, as he always did when she asked him something important. "I miss the peace of it sometimes," he admitted. "But I wouldn't trade what we have now for all the peaceful solitude in the world. This," he gestured toward the celebration, toward the rebuilt mission, toward the life they had created together. This is worth every sacrifice we made to achieve it. Even the ones we haven't made yet? Isabella asked, thinking of the challenges that still lay ahead. Building a new nation was an ongoing process, not a single achievement, and there would be difficult decisions and hard-fought battles in their future. Especially those, Jeremiah replied firmly. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together. That's what partners do. Isabella leaned against his shoulder, drawing comfort from his steady presence, as she had every day since their first meeting. I love you, Jeremiah McCall. I love you too, Isabella McCall, Queen of Nueva Esperanza, defender of the oppressed, and the most beautiful bride in the entire Southwest. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Isabella reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. She had fled her palace as a frightened refugee, thinking she had lost everything that mattered. Instead, she had found something infinitely more valuable, a partner who shared her vision of what life could be, a people who trusted her to lead them toward that vision, and a love that had transformed both of them into something greater than they could ever have been alone. The desert that had once seemed like a place of exile had become home. The man who had thought his heart was permanently broken had learned to love again. The queen who had lost her kingdom had built a better one from the ground up. "Come on, Your Majesty," Jeremiah said, offering her his arm with mock formality. "We have a treaty to sign and a nation to run." "Yes, we do," Isabella replied, taking his arm and walking with him toward the mission where representatives from two great nations waited to formally recognize the third nation they had created together. "We certainly do." Behind them, the celebration continued late into the night, the sound of laughter and music carrying across the desert like a promise that some dreams were strong enough to survive any trial, and some love was powerful enough to change the world.